following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
Welcome back to Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League. I'm Ricky Vellante, and I'll be joined by my co-host, David West. As usual, we'll be welcoming guests, challenging the status quo, doing social good, and bringing about positive change to the world, while also talking a little bit of sports. In this episode, we'll kick things off with co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer of the Professional Collegiate League and economist at OSKR, Andy Schwarz. We'll dive into the history of amateurism, the state of college athletics, and the PCL itself. After rapping with Andy, we'll be joined by actor, activist, choreographer, author, and former co-host of The View, Rosie Perez. Rosie will be discussing the parallels between today and her breakthrough film, Do the Right Thing. She'll also be discussing her personal history with activism, especially as it relates to Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican rights. We'll also get into her love of boxing and her thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host David West. We have a special guest this afternoon, co-founder in the Professional Collegiate League, our Chief Innovation Officer, and also an economist at the firm OSKR, Andy Schwarz. Andy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for finally having me on.
So Andy, the Twitterverse knows you well. You talk a lot about name, image, and likeness. You were the economic case manager on O'Bannon and Alston. You worked on the White case in the mid-2000s. You got into sports working on the Raiders case in the late 90s. All that said, what was it that originally brought you to the idea that college sports needed a shift?
Oh, well, it started as sort of an academic/economic exercise where it was pretty clear that the NCAA is an economic cartel that extracts wealth from athletes. And then from there, it became this gradual process of awakening to what that meant for the athlete and how our power structures are set up so that young people, young men, young black men in particular, have so little access to the ways that we normally get redress. So in the courts, there's tremendous deference to the NCAA as a force for good, quotes on or not. And then even the NLRB basically just didn't want to touch it. So where I was like, well, all that's left to us is essentially to outcompete the schools and really show the world that the mythology and the BS of amateurism just isn't what sells. What sells is great sports.
And so this idea of amateurism, obviously, when we were the HBL, you and I and the rest of our team, we had the tagline "Amateurism is a con." We want to dive in a bit today on exactly what that history of amateurism is, what it started as in Victorian England versus how it's been manipulated and grown and used almost as a weapon in certain societies from a political standpoint and an economic standpoint. So to kick it off, how about we start with what it originally was in Victorian England?
So there's a myth that amateurism comes to us from the ancient Greeks. That's not true. The original Olympic movement was fully professional. Athletes were awarded cash for winning, were put on pensions for winning. It was the word that Greeks would have used for amateurism was something like idiot, because the idea of doing this incredibly strenuous activity for free didn't make any sense to them. But in the 19th century, you get in Victorian England, essentially you get an aristocracy that has no purpose. The country's industrializing. You don't need to have people training to ride a horse all day, to be the vanguard of your army, things like that. The aristocracy needs to reinvent its purpose. And part of that is this creation of essentially elites-only competition. And the idea is that because we're noble, and the reason that we're noble is by birth, and one of the signs of our nobility is that we don't work. We don't have to earn our keep. Instead, we collect rents from everybody else, literally in this case, rents. That gives us the freedom to compete, but also it makes us gentlemen of leisure, and it's a very male thing as well. And so it's exclusionary. Amateurism is explicitly, if you work with your hands, you cannot compete if you're a laborer. And remember that in England, when we talk about like second class citizenship, it was literally like there are classes in England, Britain really, at this point that are de jure. It's not just a social status thing. If you are a lord, you have different rights than everybody else. For one thing, you get to be in the House of Lords. If you're a gentleman, and that's again a social status, that means you're of a certain rank in the gentry, and you have a different status in the law. What happens is out of that movement, and sort of the Oxford and Cambridge and sort of the rowing culture as an example, emerges a slightly different thing. You get Pierre de Coubertin, who is a French noble who is the father of the modern Olympic movement. And he changes how we think about amateurism a little bit. It's still, you can't be paid, but he doesn't exclude the working class or anyone from the competition. It stops being exclusionary in that sense, and it just starts being, well, you can't make money from the sport. You can work in a factory, but you can't be a professional rower. All of this is in this context of 19th century Europe, in a world that's very classist, has social classes, and is going through tumult where essentially the nobility doesn't know why it exists anymore and needs to justify itself because social status is very difficult to give up. And I mean, I wouldn't want to give it up. And so what's interesting is that when it warps over to the United States, this is hard to say with a straight face, we don't have literal second-class citizens. In the 19th century, we did. Well, in the first half of the 19th century, we clearly did. We had slaves. But even after 1865, in huge parts of the South, there are two classes of citizens. But amateurism isn't designed to distinguish between those two classes. It's really, there's all these things going on in America that handles, and I'm using the term handles from the perspective of a white supremacist, which hopefully people know I'm not, which handles the problem of how do you keep black people out. We have segregation in schools. We have simple segregation laws all over the place. What amateurism is designed to do is more back to the original Victorian idea of keeping out the white working class who couldn't afford college, who generally didn't even think about going to college, from our white aristocracy, which is not a de jure legal distinction, but just a de facto one. If you couldn't afford tuition to go to college, then if we don't pay for it, we can essentially make this a rich kids only endeavor. It's again back to being exclusionary. And we can talk probably more about what's going on. That ethos is aspirational. The NCAA doesn't have any enforcement power until the 1950s. And I think it's kind of coincidental that 1956 is when the NCAA is finally given the ability to punish schools if they violate the amateurism rules. It's real close to when Brown v. Board of Education comes in, and a system that was self-sustaining of separating blacks and whites is starting to crumble. So amateurism is right there to play the backstop. But in the interim, in that period, NCAA is founded in 1906. There had been college sports back to 1852. Rowing was the big sport back then, all the way up to 1956, while you have academic professors and university presidents saying amateurism is good in this, and we can't possibly sully ourselves with commerce and paying people. In fact, everybody's getting paid. I mean, big chunks of everybody are getting paid. The University of Pittsburgh, the whole football team was paid, and went on strike one year when the new president came in and tried to lower pay. The freshmen and sophomores were getting less than the juniors and seniors, and the whole team went on strike. And I think that year or the next year, they refused to go to the Rose Bowl unless they were given $500 each. And if you watch a movie, there's a famous Marx Brothers movie, and I guess it's kind of funny. There are elements of it that are funny. It didn't age so well, called Horse Feathers, which is all about how Groucho Marx is trying to hire a bunch of paid football players for his college to save the college. And that's really how the University of Chicago and Stanford, in some sense, rose to prominence, especially University of Chicago. Amos Alonzo Stagg was their coach, and Chicago paid the coach before that was considered a violation of amateurism. So all of this stuff is going on. The Depression hits. Nobody's getting paid for a while. World War II comes in. When everyone comes back, there's this real debate: should we actually go with real amateurism? And in 1948, the NCAA attempts for the first time to enforce amateurism with something called the Sanity Code, with the idea being, this is insane for us to be paying athletes. Let's all stop, right? And it doesn't work because the economics are such that if you can bring in a star football player, remember this is before the NFL was at all. I mean, the NFL existed, but before the NFL was at all popular. If you can bring in a star football player, this brings in tons of money. It brings in tons of reputation. Public schools that we think of now as great public schools, and I think University of Michigan is the best example of that, develop their reputation first as football powers, and they become known outside of their state. It's just a fact that if you're a good football program, people, even academics, overrate your academics relative to what you would be without the football program. And so where we end up is this critical year in 1956. The NCAA gives in. They stop trying to enforce amateurism as an exclusionary thing, and they change it completely. Now athletes can get scholarships. Now, in some sense, the process of amateurism is actually broadening the base, because now anybody can come to a university and have it paid for in exchange for services. It's a form of a salary. So amateurism.
What year was that, Andy?
1956.
So it's coinciding with the integration movement as well.
Yeah. So Brown v. Board is 1954.
Right.
I don't, and this is, I mean, we could debate this, and Ricky might differ with me. I don't think that move by itself is driven by that decision, but I do think that immediately, that when you see the ability to bring people in who could never have afforded college, and Southern blacks are in that category, that you see schools working their way towards, oh, well, we'll allow up to 2 black people on the basketball team. We don't have a majority, but and working their way towards evolving the rhetoric of white supremacy to accept the fact that in these sports, in many cases, the best person on the team is black. And that doesn't really fit with this idea of supremacy. So, there's all, I don't even want to discuss the horrible ethos and justifications that are used for why it is.
Right.
That's a different expert in a different show. So, and it takes a while. Like University of Texas doesn't allow any black athletes or black students until 1970. So it's this process. But what amateurism is then able to do, and is perfectly positioned when college sports explodes as a commercial product, and really in some sense that comes from a different board case. It's Board of Regents, which is 1984, essentially opens up college football and by extension college basketball to tremendous commercialization. Amateurism is right there to make sure that this newly empowered class of athletes, black and white, doesn't share in the profits. And so we've gone from this weird thing where it started, we don't want to have working class people in here at all. This is designed to keep them out, to this where we end up at the end, which is, bring in everybody who can't afford it, but let us keep the profits that they generate.
Right.
So I hope that wasn't too long, but that's sort of my time travel from 1850 to 2020 of where we are in terms of amateurism.
And so amateurism, Andy, for context, it was utilized in every professional league for the most part. Every professional sports league, when it started, in one way, shape, or form, had amateurism rules that, over time fell by the wayside. Yeah,
baseball. There was the best team in baseball in the early days was the Albany Knickerbockers, and they were an amateur team. And when the Cincinnati Redlegs, who are the Cincinnati Reds now, they were the first all-professional team. Teams like the Knickerbockers decried this and said, nobody will want to watch baseball anymore once it loses its gentlemanly character. And if that sounds familiar to you, that is the legal argument that still stands when the NCAA goes into antitrust court and says no one will watch college sports if the athletes are paid for their services, even though they are paid for their services. What they really mean is paid more than how much we allow them to get.
And over time, throughout the 20th century, you saw league by league, sport by sport, even country by country, all of these amateur systems fall by the wayside one way, shape, or form. It ended up in most countries. In the UK, it happened to be north and south, like in the US, where the more industrial portion of the country moved towards professionalization faster because they realized, frankly, if we professionalize, then we can put the absolute best team on the field that we can, because there is this working class of individuals that can't afford to play for free. And so, we're going to make this push. So you saw fights in rugby and soccer between the London Southern area teams versus the Northern Manchester, Liverpool clubs that wanted to professionalize, and in a lot of cases were the first teams to professionalize in those respective sports. The other one that you and I were talking about the other day that I think is always super interesting when it comes to amateurism is also Italy, because the political usage of amateurism and professionalization has always been an interesting thing that countries have done. Because when Mussolini overthrew the Kingdom of Italy in the late 1920s, in 1930, one of the first things he did was have his historians create a story, basically, that soccer originated in Italy, and then he professionalized the game so that the Italian teams would have the best players in the world. They went on to win the World Cup in 1934, the Olympics in 1936, and then the World Cup again in 1938. But all of it was nationalistic in intent to push the idea of sort of Italian superiority and fascist superiority. So it's fascinating to me how the amateurism play has been used in certain places and how it fell in others. Here we are now in college sports in 2020. You're still fighting the fight in the courtroom. So where are we at as of this very moment?
Well, I mean, there's this little league I know about called the Professional Collegiate League that is reimagining college sports. And here's the core print. This is the core economic principle of what we're trying to do at the PCL. Leave aside all of the change in the world that we want to make. If you artificially depress the value of talent by colluding among 354 D1 schools, not to provide basketball athletes with their full value, their full market value, suppress that. You create a gap between the maximum you can pay an athlete profitably and what they're getting now. That's a moment ripe for disruptive entry into the market. And the only reason that this particular cartel has done so well in staving off entry is a combination of this sort of propaganda that a lot of people who don't spend time thinking about this on a daily basis get confused. Well, of course you can't pay them. They're in college. There are so many college students who have jobs, who make money, who get paid both in their field of endeavor and on side jobs. People driving Uber and Lyft to pay for college. Like the idea that like we're going back to the 19th century. Of course you can't pay them. They're in college, and somehow this would sully the pursuit of excellence. I have to say this is probably a rare case, but I'm with Mussolini. I think if you want excellence, you pay for it. And so just on that one point, and maybe on-time trains too. But the spot we're in now allows us essentially to come in and, we're offering between $50,000 and $150,000. We're offering athletes the ability to fully commercialize their NIL and athletic reputation rights. And I think it's important to emphasize the rights because it's not a privilege. And we're negotiating with them over how we jointly commercialize group licensing, because group licensing belongs to everybody and the teams whose logos are in there. It's an enterprise based on the idea that athletes aren't second-class citizens and that compensation for services is a right, not a privilege, that choice in markets is a right enshrined in the antitrust laws, and that we think that what we're doing is a superior offer both educationally and athletically. Where we are in terms of what the NCAA is doing is, they're in a bit of a bind. I worked with Senator Nancy Skinner in California. She, with a little prodding from me, and then she took the ball and ran with it, passed a law that requires California schools starting in 2023 to recognize that right, to stop essentially commercializing athletes' name, image, and likeness, but keeping the profits. And that part of the deal to go to college can no longer include a mandate. If you want this scholarship, you must check your rights at the door with respect to name, image, and likeness. It still doesn't solve the problem of compensation for services, but it's a step. And Florida took the law, weakened it, and sped it up. So it's spurring things on. We see in Congress that there's a real push to change things. But if you look at those congressional hearings, it's very clear that if the NCAA has its way, the federal law is going to be about as anti-athlete as you can get and still claim to be involving giving athletes their rights. To just today, I think, or maybe yesterday, Senator Wicker from Mississippi revealed that more than half of the athletic directors that he asked for input said that they didn't believe college athletes had NIL rights or should be allowed to commercialize those rights. And so if that's the organization that's driving towards the solution, there's almost no way that offer is going to be real. Now, I say this, bad for America, bad for athletes, really good for the PCL because we are offering that. And that's really the idea behind what we're doing, is that the more the schools hold on to this 19th century crazy idea that somehow being the best at your craft and earning a commensurate reward, which I think is a very American thing, if they hold on to this weird 19th century European idea that earning money is crass, it's just an opportunity for us to give athletes a real choice and say, well, that's fine if that's what you want to do. Go for it, knock yourself out. But if what you want is to maximize everything about what the sport brings you, academically and educationally, that we're a much better spot.
Looping in a couple things, the Senate committee hearing, as well as some of these name, image, and likeness bills that have been passed. So we have California, Florida, and Colorado thus far. Some folks seem to misinterpret them as being the solution, the fix-all. It's something that you and I talk about quite a bit, especially in Florida and Colorado. I don't think this was as much of an issue in California, that there were certain things included in those bills that now actually make it illegal for universities to compensate the athletes directly.
Yeah, they tried that in California too, and I and some of the other co-sponsors who were advising in the background collectively said, if you do that, we will come out against the bill and we will lobby against the bill. And we staved it off. I have no input into Florida or Colorado, and those same forces stepped in and achieved that. And so this is really problematic, because if you have an existing right, and I would maintain that all athletes do, and in order to get the people who are stealing the use of it to acknowledge it, you have to give up something else in perpetuity, or at least until the law changes. It's almost a step backwards. Yes, you're going from a situation where you have a right, but you're being denied the use of it, to that right is accepted, and in a limited way, you're being allowed to use it. And this limited way is bad in some ways. Like the way the NCAA is talking about it, you won't be able to commercialize group licensing. There'll be a committee that steps in and says, oh, you're being paid too much, and so we're going to take away some of that money. And if you don't give it back, then you lose your eligibility. But in exchange for that really curtailed use of an existing right, now in Florida, it is illegal for a school to pay an athlete for the use of his NIL. So if a school wants to do a video, a cool welcome to the University of Florida video with music from a local artist, a musician, with graphics by a famous filmmaker from Florida, they can all get paid for the use of that, their talents and their intellectual property that they're creating. Their music can get licensed. But it's illegal to do the exact same thing with an athlete now in Florida. Now, it was always against NCAA rules, so pragmatically, maybe that doesn't feel like a change, but the world is changing, and essentially stealth buried into this Florida law is this, oh, no, now it's illegal. And so I think this is going to be problematic. I mean, again, once the PCL starts competing, well, we're going to be paying our athletes for their NIL. All those schools in Florida, I feel bad for them if we're recruiting against them, because it'll be illegal for them to fight back. But it's not good for America. It's not good for athletes to be in this situation where, like, the best thing for athletes is for Florida to match our offer, to beat our offer. And then if we want to go higher, right? That's competition. It's now the state essentially writing into law a a reduction in athletes' flexibility, which benefits the people outside of that law, like us, but it doesn't benefit society.
Right, right, right.
And then the last thing on some of these bills is also the no conflict policy. Something you and I talk about a lot is in terms of sequencing and timing, the moment in which the athlete has the most leverage and power is before they make the choice of where they're committing to go to school. But definitely under the Florida and Colorado bill, there is now language that would preclude an athlete from flexing that leverage or utilizing that leverage in any way, shape, or form prior to being on campus. So it's not even committing. It's you have to be enrolled on campus, and at that point, you can start to monetize your name, image, and likeness. How bad is that really for athletes? Again, I think people are overlooking that fact. They're just saying, oh, hey, they're getting rights that they have had taken away from them, so that's good. But I don't think people are actually reading the fine print.
And just to add to what you just said, which is all true, the NCAA proposal, as I understand it, would say that you can't start commercializing those rights until after fall semester is over. So for a one and done athlete, that means that essentially the first time that they could even go out into the marketplace and negotiate would be January, maybe late January, depending on what school you're at, of your freshman year. For football players, you miss your whole freshman year, essentially. And what that does economically is that makes it so that the school can pre-claim the zone of contest. If you want to advertise sneakers, and I'm a Nike school, and you can't shop around among Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, any of the Chinese companies, Umbro, whatever, before you get to school, then essentially you make this choice. You hand your choice to the school by picking a school, a Nike school. Now you're trapped, and only school company you could work with, if you're allowed to at all, is Nike, because of the way that they have these conflict things written. Contrast that with if you were a true free agent, to negotiate at age 16, which, by the way, completely fine under the PCL model. You choose which shoe company you want to work with, whether it's because you prefer the look, the feel, they perform better for you, or they offer you the most money to work with them. And then the schools essentially have to choose, well, do I want to let you continue with your Adidas deal, even though I'm a Nike school, or do I want to give up on your talent? And you drive the economics. You get the surplus, not the school. This is why I'm so thrilled that the way we've sort of figured out the knot within the PCL is that it's much more similar to the NBA and the NBPA's arrangement, which is that athletes own their shoe rights and that teams own the apparel rights. And there's no problem with one of our teams wearing one apparel company's gear and individual athletes choosing their own shoes. Once you solve that problem, it's not a conflict at all. The reason it's a conflict in the NCAA system is because that would require them to give up some money and control to the athletes. If you say you have to wear Nike and you sign a contract saying none of our athletes will wear anything else, you've created the conflict. And then the only way to solve it is to write into law, oh, well, if there's a conflict, the school wins. Because that's not the way that businesses negotiate conflicts in a normal situation. This is like all part and parcel of this idea that the NCAA's convenience and preferences. Oh, it's convenient for us to have, not to have to negotiate special deals, takes precedence over the athlete's rights. And if you listen to NCAA rhetoric, you will very rarely hear them say name, image, and likeness rights. You'll rarely hear them say profit either. They'll say they should benefit from the use of their name, image, and likeness. And the way I would say it is that they should be able to profit from the commercialization of their name, image, and likeness rights. A rights perspective is really different because rights are superior to wishes, wants, convenience. There's no right to competitive balance, as an example. Oh, if we let all the big football schools pay athletes at whatever they want in NIL, all the best talent will go to Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State. And it's like, well, first of all, they already do. And we could do a whole show on why competitive balance myths have no, there is literally no evidence that capping individual salary helps competitive balance. And David probably can think about this. The Miami Heat are their best example. In that phase of the NBA CBA, there was an individual max, and it allowed Miami to bring together Bosh and Wade and LeBron
Right.
because they were so cheap compared to their value that they like, hey, let's buy three. And so even if it made sense, that wish, well, we need to have competitive balance, that isn't superior to your competitive balance, whatever. I want my rights. And we see it turn completely backwards in the way that I think that Congress, and certainly the way that the NCAA is pushing it, that these rights are privileges and their privileges are rights. It's just backwards.
Andy, I think that's to the first of many appearances. Appreciate your time and for joining us to educate our audience a bit on the history of amateurism and on exactly what's going on with name, image, and likeness and some of the legislative and congressional pushes, both state and nationwide. So appreciate you.
Thanks very much. And I guess I would just say, if any of this outraged you, like, we're here. Come work with us in one fashion or another, because we're going to fix it.
Yeah, we are. And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host David West. Wendell Haskins is also joining us today as well, and we're joined by another special guest, actress, activist, choreographer, author, Rosie Perez. Rosie, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So we usually like to kick off these discussions. Obviously, you've had a storied career, but just giving our audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit of your background.
From Brooklyn, New York. When I was going to college for biochem out in LA, I meet Spike Lee. My whole life changes. Puts me in Do the Right Thing, and then everything happened after that. But prior to that, what people don't know is that I was dancing and I was choreographing before that movie. And my first artist was Bobby Brown. And the second artist was The Boys. And I continued with the choreography, and I continued with the acting. And I also continued with my activism. I never gave that up. Yeah, and I don't know what else to say.
Tell us about your activism, Rosie, because a lot of people don't know you as an activist like I know you as an activist. So when you say you continued your activism, where did that start for you?
Actually, it started, this girl, I was in a group home for a little bit upstate New York. And this girl that, she wasn't in the group home, but she lived in the community. It was a very well-to-do community. And she said, you were always an activist, because when the yellow school bus driver would come, he was an alcoholic. And I was young. I was still in 6th grade, and he was swerving on the road. And I had told him at 11 years old, I said, if you swerve one more time, I am going to tell everyone to get off this bus. And he goes, I dare you. He stopped. I held the thing and I go, if you hit me, don't hit me. You can't hit a kid. And I instructed all the kids to get off the bus. And I said, now somebody go to that house over there and call the parents. And the guy got fired. I was at 11 years old. That's where it all began, But when I really seriously got into activism was the AIDS movement, because so many of my friends in the nightclubs were just dropping dead. And, they were calling it the gay virus at that time. And we knew that wasn't true, because there were people who weren't gay who were contracting the virus and everything. And then this man that I was dating, Chucky, he had contracted the virus, and he had called me. He said, listen, I know, did you get tested? I go, yes, I got tested. And he goes, okay. He says, well, we haven't been together in several years, but I just wanted you to be safe. And by the way, I saw you at the AIDS dance-a-thon. I said, oh, really? You did? And he was like, yes. And you know what? Can I just give you some advice? Sure, go ahead. Show up for the cause. Don't show up for the cameras. And it changed everything for me. It changed everything, because what I have learned, I have some great, great mentors along the way. The guy who started Gay Men's Health Crisis and ACT UP, Larry Kramer, who just recently passed away, Lori Fabiano, who was the director over there, and then later went to Robin Hood, and Dennis De Leon, who used to work for the mayor's office. They were all, God rest his soul, they all schooled me. And the number one lesson was, the fight is not about you. The fight is about the fight. And there's no place for egos. And that helps you stay on course. And it also helps you control your emotions in certain situations. And, when I see that the protests that are going on today, emotions are sky high, rightfully so. And I'm looking for the next step, because another lesson that I had learned from the gay community was that the fighting doesn't stop when the marching stops. You have to get on the inside. If you don't get on the inside, you have no power. You can yell and scream all you want. You could charge up the hill, but if you're not inside that office who designed that hill, very little can be done, because we've seen these before, right? We've seen shootings and murders right in front of our eyes, and you're like, what is it going to take? That was last time, and then this time. And I think that people are starting to get smarter about activism and what it really means, and what real sustainable change means. And that all comes down to policy. It all comes down to the lawmakers. And it all comes down to your vote. And if you don't know who your elected officials are, you're going to be lost. You're going to be so lost, and you're not going to know how to move forward. You're going to be stuck in just that marching thing.
So where does the passion lie for you? So I know sometimes we have to balance, right, what we do for a living and what our public persona is with our personal causes and things that we're passionate about. So how do you find that balance, or how have you found that balance?
Wow, no one's ever asked me that question. I think I found it only a couple of years ago, to be perfectly honest. There were times where I can't go to this interview for this job, for this movie or this play because there's a march happening. Or I can't do that because I just got appointed to Obama's administration for HIV and AIDS, and I have to go down to DC. And my agents are like, what?
Right.
And I said, well, you know what? DC is equally important to me. And all of a sudden, I just figured it out. The people that were representing me at the time didn't respect my activism and didn't respect that was also a second career choice of mine, right? Because if you're going to become an activist, it's a choice, and it's also a job, so to speak, right? So when I got new representation, I sat down with them and I said, listen, I don't only want you to represent me in front and behind the camera. I also want you to represent me in the charge in regards to the causes that I believe in. And if you can't do that, and you can't have that part of my career and part of my scheduling, well, then I should look for someone else. Wow. And then I found the right place, and game changer. Right. Game changer. And that was about 8 or 9 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it took some time just to get kind of figure out, because I think sometimes, and I've dealt with this in my own personal career, just trying to find that balance. Like, well, I can't really. You want to help, but you can't help, or you want to pursue an opportunity, can't pursue an opportunity because you're convicted, right? You feel a certain kind of way, and so you have to find the right people, the right associates, right, to find that balance. So yeah, I appreciate that answer.
Yeah. And also the power of saying no, in the sense that everybody will come at you and say, I want you for this cause, and I want you for this fight, and I want you to give money to here or help raise money to there. And, with my mentors, they always told me, pick one fight and do that well. And once you know you're doing that really, really well, then you can move on. But if you spread yourself too thin, you're going to be ineffective, and it's not going to do anyone any good, because they're going to feel your exhaustion. They're going to feel your subconscious resentment that you have to show up. You know what I mean? So you really have to pick and choose what you really want to fight for. You know, I think Dave Chappelle said something very profound in his latest video where he was saying that he was being chastised and called out because he wasn't marching. And he goes, we got other people doing that. Right. You know what I mean? And that's another lesson that we need to learn is learn your position in the fight. Right. You know, and in the gay men's health crisis and the gay movement and with the AIDS and everything like that, I remember the day when, God rest his soul, Dennis De Leon, when he used to be the secretary for the mayor's office, and he created Cielo Latino Commission on AIDS. And unbeknownst to me, he had put my name in the hat for the Obama administration advisory council on HIV and AIDS. I was shocked. And he took me out to lunch and he said, I just want to let you know. I said, why me? And he said, because of your passion, that's your role. Right. That's your lane. Right. So when he's having this advisory council of everybody who is just concentrating on the metrics, which is very important, and concentrating on the bureaucracy, you need to call them out and say, wait a minute, hold up. This is what's important to the people. Right. And so I want you, it's time for you to get off the street and go inside. And I remember I just bawled like a kid because in real activism, that is a badge of honor. That is something that's like a promotion, if you will. You know what I mean? When your mentors are saying, okay, you could come inside now. You know, you've learned enough how to navigate and how to be diplomatic around the power players. So, you know.
And so within your activism, you also are a staunch supporter of Puerto Rican rights. Maybe go a little bit into that. Obviously, you are Puerto Rican, but giving us a bit of background on the passion that drives you there and specifically which rights you've been an activist for.
Well, first, let me say my overall passion for any type of fight is because I was a kid that didn't have, right? So I was one of the underprivileged kids. And I knew in my heart that the only thing that separated me from a privileged child was opportunity. That was it, you know? And the playing field was not leveled enough for me. And so when I would see an injustice, if I would see something that wasn't fair, it hit home. And it was an innate feeling of pain that I would feel. So that's my passion there. In regards to Puerto Rico, my passion lies because I'm Puerto Rican. I mean, there's no other further explanation needed. Even though I am part of the diaspora here in New York, you know, there's a saying that says, Pedro Petri, this famous Puerto Rican poet, said, I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico was born in me. You know, a lot of people who are not Puerto Rican don't understand why we're so passionate. It's like you're born. You were born into that passion, you know, you're born into that pride, what we call aguro. You know, when I went to the island of Vieques, which is right, it's part of Puerto Rico, but it's right off of Puerto Rico on the northeastern coast. And I was walking on grass that could cut your feet if you were barefoot because of the radiation deposits from the ammunition and the test bombing that the United States was doing. And then I met a woman whose child was born deformed because she was too poor. She couldn't get off of that island. And that pain came and that conviction came. So I joined that fight. And that was the first time I got arrested for protesting, which in front of the cameras, I was so brave. But as soon as that paddy wagon door closed, I was like, oh my God, we're getting arrested. You know, the older ladies were like, míralo, Rosie. You know, like, look at her. You know, it's like, they're like, this is her first time. Yay. Why isn't anybody scared? They were like, don't worry. And then the police officer in the paddy wagon, I said, what precinct are you taking me to? She goes, well, we're taking all of you to the 1-7. I went, oh, we're good. Like, everybody's looking at me because my cousin Sylvia was a police officer at the time and she worked at the 1-7. So I was like, oh, we're good. We're going to get out. You know, so we don't have to work. You know, So we were only there like for 8 hours. It was a long time, but with all those women, it was fun. It was actually fun. They kept telling us could you please be quiet? Could you stop singing songs? You know, that's where that comes from, Puerto Rico. It's just
Rosie, tell us about like your inspiration behind you making your documentary, Yo Soy Boricua, just so you know, right? Like, what was the motivation behind that, and what was the process that you went through to create that documentary?
That documentary came to me as a light bulb moment while I was at the Puerto Rican Day Parade, because everybody was chanting that old chant, and this guy made it into a song, but he didn't create it. It goes, Yo soy Boricua, pa que tú lo sepas. And it kind of feels snotty, like what it means in English is, I'm a Boricua, just so you know. And so one of my little cousins said, what does that mean? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, Boricua. I said, Boricua, before the Spaniards came to Puerto Rico, it was called the land of Borican. And the people there were called Boricuas. And they came from the indigenous people of the Taino tribe. Mm-hmm. And he looked at me like, say what? And I said, okay. And then I was like, wait a minute. That's the disconnect between the diaspora and the people on the island. So I really wanted to make that documentary because of that, so that every person can be informed as much as possible in regards to our history. You know, why are there so many Puerto Ricans in New York? You know, why are there a large Puerto Rican mass in Hawaii? Go figure, you know? And it was all comes from America's covert operation, what they called was Operation Bootstrap, where they were hoodwinking a lot of the Puerto Ricans and saying, we're going to give you free passage to America so you can pull yourselves up from your own bootstraps. But what they really wanted was cheap labor. Mm. So that's why they came to New York, because in New York, they were in the factories, predominantly in the garment district. And in South Carolina and Hawaii, it was because of Puerto Ricans are expert, at agriculture, and so it's like, there's a reason for everything, right. And so.
And usually the reason, follow the money, the old saying, right? Follow the money, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
You just gave me a light bulb moment, because here in Cleveland, Puerto Rico Day, the staging area for the parade every year is literally right in front of my building. So that was one of my first fun experiences when I moved to Cleveland, was having no idea what was going on, but all of a sudden just hearing this crazy amount of noise outside of the building, and it was the Puerto Rican Day Parade. So Cleveland's also a textile manufacturing city, so you're setting off a light bulb here.
Yeah, and my family is very loud too, right, Wendell?
Yeah. And you're the leader of the pack.
No.
Packed in that little package is a loudmouth in there.
Oh, come on, 6 so uncommon.
You hold your own pretty well. You hold your own pretty. Hey, I just found out today. Ricky told me that David West is also a boxing fan. I don't think they know how deep you are into boxing, right? Mm.
Yeah.
She's a big boxing fan, D West. Like,
nice.
Crazy with it.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
That's part of the culture too. We Puerto Ricans, we like baseball and boxing. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. Who's your favorite?
Of all time or right now?
No, right now.
Well, I actually like Ryan Garcia. That's like my
King Ryan.
Yeah, King Ryan. I like him. He's got the power and the pop, and I like a little.
So
he's got the attitude. Yeah, got a little attitude. He's cocky. I like it.
Yeah, and he's been backing it up. You know?
He hits hard.
He hits hard. I know, because everyone was saying, they're padding his fight. Well, of course. Every promoter, every smart promoter will pad their fighter up to a championship, up to the big names, up to the real.
You got to protect them, right.
You got to protect them. It's the same thing in your business. You don't just jump from high school to the NBA. Well, some people do.
Right.
But, the normal course is not
Right.
that, and so, but he backs it up, and I think he's so good, and he's getting modeling contracts
Yeah,
and
he's got the whole
everything.
package to me.
He has the whole package.
What's the last big fight you've been to, Rosie?
The last big fight, Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz at the
Oof.
Garden.
Oof.
I was fourth row, third row from ringside. And I was sitting next to the amazing champion, Clarissa Shields.
Mm.
And she was rooting for Anthony Joshua, as was I, as majority of the crowd there.
Right.
And I had said in an previous interview, I was like, I'm going for Joshua, but don't count Ruiz out. He could box. And everybody's like, nah, right? And so then when they started going, I saw Ruiz tag him really, really hard. What was it, third or fourth round?
Yeah.
And I said, Joshua's done. Joshua's done. Clarissa Shields looked at me and she goes, what did you say? I go, nothing. I didn't know. Oh, I'm good. No, I'm sorry. She's so big. Actually, nothing because she's like this big. And she's just like so strong. And but that was my last fight. That was pretty amazing. Last big fight. Prior to that was in Los Angeles, and it was Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury.
Mm. Yeah, you've been to the big fights.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I go to the smaller fights too. I love going to see prospects.
Mm-hmm.
Prospect fights, like 4, 6, 8, 10 rounders, because that's how people are like, how do you know so much of this fighter? Well, I track them.
Right, you watch them, right?
Yeah.
I know absolutely nothing about boxing, but I will say, again, here in Cleveland, we have the best Puerto Rican baseball player, Frankie Lindor. So we're very thankful for that.
Right.
So your first feature role and was a breakthrough role for you. You already mentioned Spike Lee's, Do the Right Thing. Obviously, there's quite a bit of that film that's very relevant today, especially given the murder of George Floyd with the Black Lives Movement protests and all. How has that impacted you in any way? Has that come back up at all? Have you been thinking about sort of the parallel tracks to that film with what we've seen play out over the last couple of months now?
Yeah, it's pretty sad that it's still relevant. And it's pretty disturbing how many Americans, actually how many people in the whole world had no idea of the history of chokehold here in America, with police brutalities specifically towards people of color. And, that was the whole reason why Spike made Do the Right Thing. It was based on an event, sad to say. And it's really strange because, COVID, I've been inside, I'm like really paranoid, but the times that I have gone out, and if someone sees me, I have like parents my age where I was at the Wegman store, pull on their teenage kid, and goes, "That's the girl in Do the Right Thing that we watched last night." And I went, "What?" And the kid was like, "Oh my God, you were." I go, "Oh God," because then I'm not thinking about the political side of it. I'm thinking about the right? And the mother's going, "Thank you for that really important film." And the kid is looking at me like, "Oh, shorty."
Right.
Oh my God. So it's been really strange. But I'm getting a lot of calls and emails from people from all around the world, and people on the social, just where they had no idea, how powerful and potent that film is, and it's sad that it's being used as a re-education of police brutality in America.
It's the
What do you?
same old song, right? I mean, how
Right.
long? What year was "Do the Right Thing" made? What year was that?
It was released in '89, but it was 1988.
88,
Yeah.
right?
What are your thoughts? Just I don't want to transition away from that, but I think that sort of. So I grew up in the '90s, right? And so I'm gonna contain myself here. But like you. So you were in White Men Can't Jump. You were a part of In Living Color. You were a part of the Spike Lee classic, right? Where do you think the so I don't see right now what people like yourself were producing and a part of in the '90s. I don't see that right now. That's just me personally in terms of the content, the generational stuff. You know what I mean? Like what you like White Men Can't Jump is gonna be around forever. You know what I mean? Like Spike's work that you did, that work is gonna be around forever. And I feel like there's a gap because I don't feel like that type of stuff, those types of messages, those type of powerful, like there was a lot. You were an actress in Do the Right Thing, but there were a lot of other powerful people. Like you all were working together. You know what I mean? Like in Living Color, for instance, like that show was like the who's who of everybody, right? So now I look at it and I don't see that mastery coming out of Hollywood. I don't feel it like I felt it then. And I'm just asking as a fan, someone who's do you feel that? And I think again, since we can't we have to go back to Do the Right Thing to find a movie, right, that sort of speaks to the power of this moment that we're in right now. It's not something that was made last year, something that was made 2 or 3 years ago. Like I feel like that the powerful images and the powerful people that produce those images, we just aren't seeing that anymore. And someone like yourself, you've been a part of iconic productions. And where do you think we are now?
Well, I think that in the last couple of years, it started to change. When you look at stuff that Barry Jenkins has done, like was it Moonlight?
Like, yeah.
Moonlight, what Ava DuVernay has been doing, what
Okay.
John Ridley has been doing. He wrote 12 Years a Slave. He did American Crime. I think that it's starting up again, and it just happened to coincide with this movement as well. But I
Okay.
think what happened is that back then, those filmmakers were concentrated on capturing the zeitgeist of the moment,
Okay.
right? So what was going on in New York City, Spike caught. What was going on in California in the beach basketball culture, Ron Shelton caught.
Right.
You know what I mean? Fox Network was smart enough to give the Wayans their own TV production and let them have the reins, because they were understanding the zeitgeist of that moment. Whereas now, the zeitgeist kind of exists on your iPhone,
Okay.
right? So it's different. Like I think that now, like if you look at a lot of the content coming out of HBO now, it's about young kids doing Molly and drugs, but that's real. That's what's happening.
Right.
I think that there was a part of America that everybody was asleep. So that's what was being reflected. And there was only a few brave filmmakers like Barry Jenkins, like John Ridley, that were like, well, wait. This shit is still happening.
Right.
It's still going on. Why aren't we taking advantage of the platform that's in front of us? And you know what? If you want to complain and say the platform isn't there, then make it.
Right.
Because that's what Spike Lee did.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's what Keenan Ivory Wayans did. That's what I did. Right. Nobody gave me nothing. You know what I mean? And I was like, wait a minute, that's my seat at the table. How come you're not pulling out that chair for me? Okay, fine, I'll pull it out myself and I will sit down. Thank you very much. Right. But I think that there was this complacency of just numbness.
Yeah.
And people weren't seeing what was really happening in real time, in real life, because in most young people's mind, what was happening was this.
Right.
You know what I mean? Of them recording their moments and not really understanding what was going out in the world. And then all of a sudden they went like this and then turned it on the world.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then we got, George Floyd, and we got,
Right.
Eric Gardner, and we got all of these things that just started happening and bubbling. It's just, it was such, it's funny that we say we're in an isolated state now. I said to someone, young people have been in an isolated state for a long time. They've been in front of their laptops. They've been in front of their iPhones. They've been, Instagramming their life, not worrying about what's going on in the rest of the world.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. And I think it's changing. And I know it's changing right now, especially in Hollywood. They're very nervous. No pun intended. They want to do the right thing, The door's open for us. Get in where you can fit in, It's like, you are not right. I said, it's true though.
Right.
It's true.
Do it, right?
Now is the time to take advantage and move forward. Don't think it's messed up. What's messed up is that they never allowed us these opportunities before.
Right.
So if they are going to offer these opportunities, whether it be based on their guilt or not,
Right.
Take it.
Right.
Take it. Be smart about it. So I don't know. That's what I think.
Throwing this out there as something that I noticed as well throughout the 90s, there was sort of a reactionary way in which the glorification of police through television and through film became normalized as sort of a counter, I think, to some of those films from the late 80s, early 90s. And America kind of fell for the okie doke of, okay, they can do these things because it's for the greater good sort of messaging that happened so strongly and in your face through the 90s, and especially post 9/11, that happened from a television and film standpoint. I think people are sort of coming out of the fog from that.
Right.
Yes, good point. Yeah. Definitely.
I definitely see that. And just to validate your point, Law and Order, September 13th, 1990 was when first episode of that show was shot. So it was literally September 13th, 1990. And that started that kind of, you're right. So it kind of started that reshaping how people, and I'm glad thank you for answering that, because that's something that I try to ask folks who I encounter, because I think that I'm not necessarily a creative, but I like to create things. And I think that the creative process has gone, like I'm sitting watching Live in Color with my kids now. Like my kids are 11 and 14, and we're literally watching nothing but 90s television. We're watching, man, I'm serious, man. We're watching Family Matters. We watched Do the Right Thing maybe 4 or 5 months ago. My daughter turned 14. We're watching that stuff because I'm like, yo, I can relate and I can give them stories through some of that stuff in entertainment, because the stuff that's at their fingertips in these phones, I just can't trust it. I just can't trust it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I also think part of the movement of back then too was kind of like how the hip hop movement emerged, where when it started, MTV didn't exist. So MTV wasn't dictating the playlist. They weren't dictating the style.
Right.
We were dictating that to them. And if you remember when MTV started, they never played a rap song.
Right.
They barely got, a black person up in there singing. Forget about a Spanish person. You know what I'm saying? Right. Who's that guy from Earth, Wind and Fire that did with Genesis? Philip Bailey.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You probably saw him on it, with the, but that's about it, or Michael Jackson, of course. And, but there was an audacity in the culture that didn't care about what you thought was proper, what you thought was commercial, what you thought was a source of entertainment, because the hip hop movement comes from the post-Vietnam era, right? So we are the children of the post-Vietnam era, of the post-Korean War era. And so there was, during the 70s in America, was poverty stricken. I didn't have money to go to a club. I didn't have money to have a sleepover. When I went to the group home and I went to this white person's house and they had a sleepover, I said, I want this. Oh my God, I want this. Oh my God, you have a life like on TV.
Right.
Seriously, I was like, you have a den. Oh my God, like in Bewitched. I was like, oh my goodness, but, back in Brooklyn, we didn't have that. We didn't have access to that if it wasn't on the screen. So if we wanted to go out and express ourselves, we had to go outside. We had to sit on the stoop. We had to play on the street. We had to play in the yards. And so people just started doing jams. That's how hip hop was created. It wasn't a black thing. It was an urban thing. Yeah. It was an urban thing. It was an urban experience that a bunch of kids that came from a certain social economics crowd came together and just made something happen.
Yeah. And if you knew, right? Like if you knew and you were part of the culture, you were part of a culture that nobody else understood because there was no blueprint for it. And you talk about MTV, we couldn't even listen to our own music on the radio at that time.
Yeah, I was going to say radio. It was like Rosie, Friday night?
We used to have to listen to like Mr. Magic and and like BLS or Red Alert or something at like 1 o'clock in the morning with your with a cassette and listen to it so you could play it the next day just so you could hear it again. Yes. Because you couldn't hear, your music that time being played on radio because mainstream radio didn't even want to play hip hop music. They didn't even understand it, didn't get it. They didn't think it was valid. And we would just jam into it, going to the Rink in Bergenfield and Uptown. And I mean, it was like, yeah, the Rink.
There you go.
So, the thing about that culture, which Rosie was a part of and I was a part of, is that we were the creators of a whole culture and part of the movement from day one and understood it. So, it was just something that no one could dictate to you, how you wore your clothes and your pants and your hat. And there was a uniform that went along with this culture, right? The music and everything that you did that was just foreign to everyone. And I think every generation kind of has that, right? And I mean, you're experiencing it right now. And so am I with kids, right? Your kids generally do something that you're not familiar with. You know what I mean? Every generation. Because, when I was listening to hip hop in the car with my parents, my mother would say, what the hell is this you listening to? Like, do you hear what they're saying? And they're like, hip, hop, hippie to the hippity, hip, hop. She's like, what are you even saying? What are you talking about? And usually every generation has this rebellious music of their own that generally they can't understand. But for us, like that whole hip hop movement, it was ours. It was something that was ours, and we loved it, and we understood it, and we lived the culture. So it was a great time. And then for it to evolve for opportunities is for us to have jobs, right? To have jobs doing it. Like white folks had jobs styling and choreographing and doing that stuff for years. We had no idea that those could even be careers for people, right? Here's Rosie, hip hop dancer. Now she's choreographer in the clubs, on a TV show, and the Fly Girls, and made a whole career for herself as a choreographer and becomes a major actress and so forth. So it was a great time, a great thing to be a part of from its inception, right? And I think that's what bonds us, all of us, to a certain extent, right, Rosie? Like, we all knew each other in a certain era, and it was like, who the real ones are from the culture, and we've seen each other blossom and grow and get an opportunity to do things with each other. And when we're able to unite, it's always like wonderful because we know where we all came from.
Yeah, it's fun. But the audacity is, I think, rearing its beautiful head now, because the audacity for young kids to take to the streets nonstop, that's something powerful. And it's giving older people the audacity, people of color, to say, wait a minute, let me do this. I want to do this. I want to make this film about this subject. I want to make this TV show about this subject. I want to write this book. I want to do it this way. I want to do it my way. I don't want you to tell me how to do it. It's having its resurgence. And I think it's very hopeful. I'm not 100% on how everything's going to play out. But I'm very, very hopeful in that sense. And I hope that I think whether you believe in God or not, or, spirits or powers that be or whatever, I think, or Mother Nature, I think COVID took the world and went, sit your ass down and be still.
Right.
Sit down and shut up.
And spend time with your family and get locked in and get to know them all over again.
And it forced people to put down their phones and put down their laptops and spend quality time watching a movie together with their children. Spend quality time of sitting down to a meal again, with each other. And what happens is that when you have that time, that's the thing that kind of went away for humankind is time. We're always on the move, we're always doing this and that. But like back in the day, we had a lot of time on our hands, and so our imaginations just started going and going and going. And I'm hopeful that that's gonna take place now. Hopefully, I think so. Because what I'm hearing is there's a lot of creative juices flowing, and people are ready for change.
Well, out of that optimistic message, Rosie, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an awesome conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, it was my pleasure. That's it.
Rosie, thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you.
We appreciate you.
All right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League. Forward Thinking is hosted by David West and myself, Ricky Volante. It is produced by Rafa Hernandez Brito, Wendell Haskins, and myself. And the music is by David West. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and our PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. We look forward to joining you again next week. In the meantime, stay safe.